People seldom look up. Throughout my time observing the everyday activities of humans, I've noticed several quirks about them. Many of these can be used to my advantage. One such quirk is that people seldom look up. Whether sitting alone in a dark room, running panicked through a forest, or dining in a crowded restaurant, they rarely glance skyward. I'm uncertain of the reason for this lack of upward glances, but it works in my favor. You see, I am a cunning creature that relishes tormenting humans. Like other malicious beings, I have my unique method of instilling fear and sometimes causing harm. The best way to observe humans unnoticed is to cling to the ceiling and peer down at them. It delights me to produce faint noises, those creaks and groans many hear in the night, and observe as paranoia sets in. If I execute this perfectly, the ensuing fear is palpable. I might stretch one of my long black legs down, tap a shoulder, brush against a limb, or even extinguish a light. The unsuspecting human might scan their surroundings, but as I've mentioned, they seldom look up. While I might not harm them, I revel in their reactions and the increasing paranoia. Later, I observe their restless sleep. Since many lie on their backs, they often look up, forcing me to hide in a closet or under the bed. Most don't sleep well after my antics. Some rationalize the situation to calm themselves, which I find amusing. It's typically when I decide to move on to my next victim. However, when someone remains unfazed by my antics, my frustration mounts. This is when I wish to conclude the night's amusement, leaving my chosen companion in a gelatinous state. If only they looked up, they might stand a chance against me. I'm not invincible, merely another nocturnal creature. If someone does glance up, which has occurred occasionally, I flash a wide, sharp-toothed grin and might even offer praise. But their fate is sealed. It's pitiable how victims remain unaware as I envelop them, preparing to thrust the claw at my arm's end through their back, ripping into their neck. If only they looked up, they could potentially flee. I rarely pursue, but they seldom look up. Which is why, right now, I'm gazing down at you. Don't look up, friend. I doubt you'll appreciate the sight. Red, ruby, crimson, scarlet, the color of fire, of passion, of pain. Red. How I love it. It was beautiful. The boldness, the warmth of the color stirred something deep inside me. It whispered to the very core of my being. Dark, seductive, velvet promises of unrivaled pain and pleasure. It made me feel alive, but it was so rarely found pure and untouched. Red. Its essence, I could only behold it in fleeting glimpses. It always vanished before I could really appreciate that loveliness. Blossoms wilted, makeup faded, and the garments of passers-by were never the right shade. I hungered for something deeper, richer than those glimpses of beauty. It was then that something occurred to me. The color of fire, of passion, of anger, of pain. It was also the color, blood. Once that idea took hold of me, you can be sure it did not relinquish its hold easily. Blood was everywhere, whole rivers of it pulsing through the veins of billions of people around me. I had enough to paint the whole bleak, dull world red. I started my first a year ago, I believe. I remember thinking her skin would make a wonderful canvas, smooth and pale, and it did. Skin is so boring, so neutral and flat. So I took her to a narrow, winding street that led to a dead end, offering to walk her home, as it had gotten very late. And I reached into my pocket and closed my trembling fingers around the handle of the blade I had sharpened earlier. I painted her red that night, she and I both. I felt a strange rush of something akin to euphoria, dragging the sharp, gleaming steel across the soft white surface, and watched it come alive with red. I drew back and cut again and again in long, sweeping curves. Back, torso, shoulders, hips, stomach, wrists, thighs. It was even better than I'd imagined. Rich, flowing crimson poured out of every gash I'd made and splashed onto my hands, my knife, my clothes, the street. No one heard her screams, just as no one heard my delighted laughter as I sliced open her neck in one clean movement, watched as the last lovely red poured out, warming and gushing into the street, into the dark, deserted street as the last spark of light in her eyes went out. I stayed for a while, with her still warm corpse in my arms, relishing the fresh, glistening colour and smiling gently. I knew then that I would do this again, without the slightest hint of remorse. She had been just like everyone else, plain and unnoticed. I'd made her beautiful. I had painted her red, every inch, the purest, brightest red I could find. It was a bit messy, but that was really to be expected for the first time. The next one would be a work of art. I don't understand. They made me stop. I was completing my masterpiece. 2 children, perhaps brother and sister, I planned to carve rosebuds into their skin. I had gotten quite good at making various designs and patterns, but they put binds on me and forced me into a flashing, wailing car, covering up my hard work with ugly patches of cotton and asked me questions I did not understand. They called me awful things, a psychopath, a murderer, a lunatic. They took my knife away. I was only an artist. I tried to explain. My blade was my paintbrush, the world was my canvas, its people my ink. I made them beautiful in death. If only they would let me show them, let me cut them, they might see how lovely it was. But they did not. No one understood. They repeated themselves endlessly. Murder, homicide, mutilation, assault, kidnapping, killing. Ugly words, hateful words. They didn't listen. Did they want the world to be boring? To spend their lives in a monochromatic shadow of I could have made it? Perhaps they did. They wouldn't answer my questions, would only throw more words at me. Senseless, awful words. I was not any of the things they called me. I was an artist. They were the cruel ones, calling me names and locking me away. I was not. But it's okay. Even though I was kept out of reach, even though I was placed in this shiny, white, unreasonably clean metal box they call a hospital, even though they won't let me see anyone else, it's okay. Because I didn't need a knife to cut. I didn't need others to paint. I had gallons of red, pulsing and flowing in my veins. I had my teeth, my nails as brushes. The walls of the hospital room, clean and stark, would make a perfect backdrop. It was only a pity that I wouldn't be able to enjoy my last piece of artwork, this last splash of red, myself. The walk-in closet was supposed to be her sanctuary, but now it felt like a prison. She'd gone in to grab a sweater, but as she reached for the door, it wouldn't budge. The handle refused to turn, as if someone had locked it from the other side. She panicked, rattling the door with all her might, but it wouldn't open. Her phone was in the living room, and she couldn't hear if anyone was calling her. She was trapped, alone in the dark. Hours passed. Her throat was raw from screaming and she was cold, trembling from fear and the chill of the closet. She tried to take deep breaths and tried to calm herself, but nothing worked. Her mind started playing tricks on her. She could swear she heard whispers and faint footsteps outside the closet, but maybe it was just her imagination. And then, the whispering became clearer. She could hear the sound of someone moving about in the room outside the closet. Her breath caught in her throat as she listened intently. It was a man's voice, soft and low, but she couldn't make out what he was saying. She wanted to scream for help, but she was too afraid. What if he heard her? What if he was the one who locked her in here? The sound of the man moving around grew louder, and then the closet door started to shake. He was trying to open it. She pushed against the door with all her strength, but it wouldn't hold. She felt his breath on the back of her neck as the door opened, and she turned around to face him. But no one was there. The room was empty. She felt a cold hand brush against her ankle, and she screamed. She tried to scramble back, but there was nowhere to go. She felt hands grabbing her, pulling her back into the closet, and then darkness. When her husband came home later that evening, he found the walk-in closet door open and empty. After coming back downstairs, he noticed that her house keys were resting on the hallway table next to her purse, and her phone reflected the lamp's yellowish light right into his eyes as he entered the living room. There was no sign of his wife anywhere. He called the police, but they couldn't find a trace of her. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Years later, the new owners of the house reported strange occurrences: whispers in the middle of the night, doors slamming shut on their own, and the sound of someone moving around the house. They say that the walk-in closet is cursed, and that anyone who enters it after midnight and closes the door never comes out. And if you listen closely, you might hear the faint whispers of a woman's voice, begging for help, trapped in the darkness. Someone knows everything about my life and wrote a book about it. It was a television advertisement. I remember the voice of Keith David asking, "If someone wrote a book about your life, would anyone want to read it?" There was a parcel on my front porch 7 years ago. I didn't order it, and I didn't know who sent it. No return address. There was a book inside, an old and tattered leather-bound thing. The paper smelled of age and wear, but the story written on the pages was the story of my life. I scanned through the first chapter, and it was filled with stories my parents had told me about my birth and when I was a baby. Then I did something I wish I hadn't. I did what anyone would do. I skipped to the end. On the last page, my husband was told that I had taken my own life. I closed the book. I should have burned it, but I hid it in my closet. Over that next week, when my husband was asleep, I would read. It gave me insights into my life. Things I had perceived incorrectly. Things I had done right. Things I had done so very wrong. It wasn't just me. The people in my life were also incredibly detailed in their interactions with me. It would occasionally break the narrative from me and follow them as they were dealing with or thinking about me. As the days went on, I began to learn things about my husband, family, and friends. None of them were who I thought they were. They were far more complex than I ever gave them credit for. Their faults and secrets they kept from me. I began to appreciate them for everything, even their faults. They were naked on the pages along with me, and I loved them for it. My husband was more damaged than I could have thought, but I loved him even more. My relationships got better with everyone, in spite of some of the ugly things I was reading, and I began to understand myself and forgive myself as the story progressed. About halfway through, I came to my pregnancy. I stopped reading. Our little girl was a miracle baby. Hard pregnancy. A hard, short life. She was born too damaged to live. I hid the book in the closet, and I kept it there for years. Tonight, I started reading the book again, picking up where I left off. My husband started slipping things into my food and drinks during my pregnancy. He wanted me to miscarry. I flipped forward. The doctor believed I caused the birth defects. I flipped forward. Less than a year after she was born, my husband stood over her crib. He smothered her while I was asleep. He hated our baby. I flipped forward. The last chapter. My husband found the book and read it. I flip forward. I'm reading the book, and my husband is standing just outside of the closet. He has our gun. I'm a photographer, self-taught to be exact. At the moment, I'm working in my dark room to develop some pictures for my portfolio. The pictures are resting in trays filled with chemicals, one a mixture, another acetic acid, and the last with ammonium thiosulfate. That's one thing that I learned about photography. You have to wait. You have to be patient. I have a confession to make. I don't like showing people my work. I know that sounds ridiculous. What kind of photographer doesn't want to show the world his work? Isn't that the point of photography? To catch a moment in time and share it? Well, I'm just embarrassed. You see, I don't like rejection. Not after I was rejected by Insight, a popular people's magazine. Their claim is that they only post articles and artwork from average, everyday people. I got my hopes up, and I shouldn't have. I remember being so excited, so eager when I met with the senior photographer of Insight. It was a dream come true. There was small talk at first and coffee. But then I showed him my portfolio. I watched as his demeanor changed, and our meeting ended shortly afterward. He claimed that I didn't have a photographer's eye, that my work was unoriginal, useless to the magazine. I refused to believe him at first. One person's opinion shouldn't mean anything, but after hearing those words, I eventually accepted them. I didn't have a photographer's eye. Photographers tend to have themes in their work. Some take pictures of nature, while others photograph buildings or weddings. My work was cliched. It was a mixture of everything: puppies, couples, flowers, and sunsets. It was terrible, unoriginal. I was on the verge of giving up. I found my photographer's eye despite it being in an untraditional way. My passion returned, and I realized what my theme would be. Eyes. Hear me out on this. Eyes are the windows to human emotion. There's happiness, fear, anger, surprise, sadness, and so much more to capture in photographs. Eyes are the perfect subjects, but not in the literal sense. It's not easy taking pictures of someone's eyes. Most people don't like getting their picture taken, and people are always on the move. I'm not some creep. After I photograph someone's eyes, I let them know about it, and I explain my project to them. Most people don't appreciate it, so a lot of my pictures are of frustration or surprise. Anger is pretty popular too. You know, I've felt so confident lately that I'm letting my girlfriend tour my darkroom today. She's never seen it before, and I'm so excited to show her. By now, my pictures have finished developing, and I pin them on a clothesline to dry. These pictures were taken in a local bakery. I love going there. Everyone is so happy, especially Sarah, a young woman that works there. We're familiar with each other because I frequent the bakery often. She's happy to pose for me if I buy a few sweets. It's a pleasant exchange. I'm just glad that she humors me. Despite my recent confidence, there has been a few doubts in the back of my mind. It took me a while to figure it out. It's my girlfriend. I take photographs of her often, but her eyes aren't as happy anymore. I don't understand why. I compared recent photographs to photographs of her eyes from a few months ago, and there has been a deliberate change. Something must be bothering her. I tried to ignore it at first, but it's starting to interfere with my work. I feel like it's because I've been spending a little more time with my camera than with her. She's always understood in the past, though. I cross over to a dark cabinet filled with developing equipment, lenses and Polaroids. I nudge an old camera aside and remove a giant glass jar filled with preservatives. I set the jar on the counter and smile down at its contents. In the red glare of my safe light, I see two eyes staring back at me. I brush my finger across the surface of the jar and take a deep breath. It's a simple procedure. Well, I wouldn't call it a procedure without all the necessary equipment. Trust me, though. I've done this before with the senior photographer of Insight. He's how I got my photographer's eyes. And, don't worry, I found suitable replacements for him. 20/20 Vision 2. I do regret the scarring, though. I was a bit nervous, so I had a shaky hand when amputating them. To my knowledge, the procedure was extremely successful. I mean, look at me. If I operated on myself, I can operate on another person. I know it will work. With Sarah's eyes, my girlfriend will finally be happy again. I hear footsteps on the stairs, and I smile as I hear a knock on the darkroom door. Come in, sweetheart. Some are inherently blessed with the ability to spin words into tales, as a glass spinner creates iridescent globes and fairy wings from the thinnest strands of molten sand. They can take the small components and, with ease and finesse, lay them over one another time and time again until the moment that the masterpiece is complete. At this point, the light catches on a single aspect and sets the whole thing shining and sparkling to all who receive it. All in all, it is a beautiful thing. I myself am not equipped with such a gift, but one of my acquaintances some time back invariably was. The subject was of no matter to him. He could make even the dullest topics become a whirl of mystery and intrigue, exciting the mind and awakening the inner eye to explore. Any dinner party at which he was in attendance ended with all ears and eyes fixated on him as he described the plain, grimy world around us in a new light. He made it richer than any of us could have previously imagined, turning watercress sellers and hansom cabs into princesses and chariots of gold. Leaving the musty rooms we had been crammed into and entering the polluted air afterwards was always a treat, for one moment the rot of the Thames spread the scent of lavender thrilling across the city, and the mist swirling around our ankles was cool and sparkling, a Queen Mab's tool. Each morning waking up, however, we found the magic of the previous night much faded. Indeed, the lavender smell was barely more than a trace of memory in our nostrils, and the dreams we had found slinking across the pavement were now dense fogs which we cursed as they obstructed our vision. We could not peel back the layer of filth our world was wrapped in on our own. We needed his tongue to cut a small hole in the seal and let us truly see. One night, after everyone else had left to glimpse the world beyond our own, us two sat in front of a blazing fire. In it, I could see visions of knights battling dragons and heiresses, fighting desperately for their inheritance. The gold and blue stories in front of me were so enthralling that I barely noticed his cough. However, I did notice, and so looked up to find him staring intently into my eyes, into my very soul. A slight ripple of discomfort slid down my spine, and I sat a bit straighter, intending to address him. However, my tongue was leaden in my mouth, and my vocal cords paralyzed. The most I could do was part my lips slightly, and wait for him to speak, and spread his enchantment over the dull. When he did speak, it was slowly, and after several minutes of my attempting to make a sound. His dark gaze remaining steady upon mine, he parted his own lips and let the velvet of his voice roll through the room. "There is one story I have told none of you yet," he said quietly. "It is not one I relish, nor one that you will, but indeed it is a story, and no story bears not telling." I remained unable to speak, and taking my silence as an affirmation of my willingness to listen, he sat back and began. "Years ago I was met with a woman by the name of Rowena. She was a misplaced goddess in our world. She glided rather than walked, and sang rather than spoke. She had the beauty of spring and the cold of a winter moon in her eye, and spoke to none but me. When we met outside her chambers late at night, she would weave new meanings for all things into my consciousness. I would leave at first light to return to my boarding house, only to discover that the epoch of my life had taken on a grey tinge that I never could dispel. While it was Rowena's words that cast the shadow, for brief interludes they also banished them, and so I visited her with increasing frequency. One night, when I had ridden, desperate and feverish, to our usual meeting place, I saw something peculiar through the windows of her home. It was an odd, silvery glow, which also bore a vague hint of sickly green, and it shone from every crack in every curtain. Disturbed, I approached the door and found it ajar. Without hesitation, for I urgently required the life her words breathed into me, I stepped over the door jamb and into her abode for the first and last time. Here my friend paused and drew deeply from a large glass of brandy perched on his armchair. I watched intently, as if his every move would have some bearing on the tale he told. After drinking, he sighed deeply and plunged us once again into the storyscape. My first impression was of the uncanny cold. It was mid-July and sweltering outside. At this moment, with my face bathed in the strange glow and goosebumps puckering my arms, I had a thought of returning, but it was an unbearable future that awaited me if I did so. The drawn faces of all I knew and the gloomy grey of each object I touched were enough to make me push forward into the light. As I drew nearer the lady's bedchambers, I noticed that the light began to pulse slightly with each step I took, and that a darker mist was curling around the silver beams. Again, I thought to turn around, and again her words nudged me onward. At last, I was at Rowena's door. It was of dark ebony, with a doorknob, it seemed, of bone. I looked straight ahead, seeing the lady in my mind's eye, and reached out to grip and turn it automatically. The door swung open at once, and I was confronted with a ghastly sight. There was the Lady Rowena, standing in the middle of the room, her arms extended and hair swirling about her upturned face. Her cruel mouth was open in a silent scream, and from it shone the light, and from it poured the mist. It wove around her ivory fingers and formed nightmares at her feet. I had frozen with fear and could not run when she began to turn towards me and tip her head down. Her mouth remained open as she turned soulless eyes to meet mine and raised a hand to let the mist cascade towards me. The first chilling brush of the black against my skin returned me to my senses, and I bolted from the room. As I rushed through the corridors, an awful laugh followed me, standing my hair on end and moving my legs to pump faster. I reached the yard and tore to the place where my horse was tethered. I sliced the rope holding the straining creature to a fence post with my penknife, then leaped upon his back and urged him faster, faster, until we were well away. The next day, riding cautiously by, I viewed a blackened shell of a home where Rowena had once dwelt, with no evidence of life anywhere around it. The man sat back wearily in his chair. His eyes sagged, and a tear slid down one cheek. Regardless of his exhaustion, he continued his story promptly. It was a night of horrors that has stayed with me. It is only by convincing myself as well as others of the world's grace, if only temporarily, that I keep myself from the blackness of despair. I reached out to rest a hand upon his arm, but he was suddenly invigorated and shook it away. Leave me now. There is none more to tell, no words left to give. On the morrow you shall see why. For now, let me rest as I am able, without interruption. I nodded and left the room, giving word to his servants not to permit any to disturb him. I slept uneasily that night, visions of mist and screams invading my dreams, and woke early to hurriedly dress and head over to his house. Upon arriving, I was stopped by multiple policemen from approaching. My query as to what had occurred received a perplexing answer. Seems the old bloke killed hisself, found a pistol by his side and all. The window was open too, like he thought of jumping. Guess he figured the bullet'd be quicker. Odd thing though, The policeman took a draw from his pipe. He looked sort of sunken, you know, like all the life had been sucked out of him rather than blown out. Here he was, called into the house by another officer, and tipped his hat to me. "Good day, chap." And he was gone. As his back disappeared into the house, I caught sight of a creeping black mist out of the corner of my eye, and a strange silvery light shone from an alleyway nearby. I left London, never to look upon the house again. Sometimes, though, I find myself speaking like the man I once knew, see a creeping mist out of the corner of my eye. The awful truth is that he conferred a curse upon my soul, a curse gained from words and death which can only be passed in the same way, a curse which shall be borne by my confidant and his after him, until the world is cleared of any form of life and the words truly, beautifully die. Carry it well.